Back here on our program, Jones and Company, and having a conversation with LutherSmith today, who is a veteran public servant in our country, having served as permanent secretary in several ministries. And of course, you heard him say that he also served governments outside the Bahamas. Mr. Smith, let me put it directly to you. After 1992, the public service was downgraded insofar as it became overly politicized. The politicians decided that they were going to put in place their friends, people who did not have training in public administration to run ministries. Isn't that right?
Well, it probably, the history will tell us about that, and you can see there's mass evidence of that. But I think what happened is that the persons who came in to the public service through what I would call an unusual way, circuitous route after 1992, all made their case that, look, I could be as good as that person there. And many of them realized, I remember one particular individual, I was then the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Education, said to me quite plainly, she says, I am coming in there, but I really do not know what to do. I'm counting on you to help me through. But you know, that's the nature of politics. That's the nature of politics.
That was the beginning of the slide and the downward slide.
I think it can be traced to that.
Yes.
It can be traced to that. Several objective observers, in fact, just this week, before this little tut-tut going on in the newspapers and over the IDB report came up, we were talking and that same point was raised. And there was not a restraining force at that time on the then Prime Minister and his government to say, well, Prime Minister, you know, we can help you if this is what you want. If you want to bring Wendell Jones in from being the vice principal of 8 Mile Rock School, fine. But here's the program we are going to have to put in place so that Wendell Jones can get into the system.
And that person should have been properly trained.
That's right. Well, it should have been properly trained. Not just the experience, not having been in the public service, as many of them would have been, for over 20 or 25 years, and say, well, I've been in the service for 25 years. But you've been in the service as a specific person. There were people who came in from the Ministry of Agriculture, Colin Higgs, Ronnie Thompson, et cetera, but they were persons who had technical backgrounds, but with some administrative experience.
They went through a course.
They went through all of those courses.
Yeah.
They all had done those courses. They had done the administrative cadet courses. They had done other strategic management courses, et cetera, et cetera. If I could make a point here, which I think is interesting, a gentleman, J.E. Delvaux, Japheth Edison Delvaux, passed away last week. He's from Major's Key in Crocodile, and he had worked in customs for a while. And he eventually became a permanent secretary. And I think his last posting was at the Ministry of Youth and Sports.
But he was also in the Treasury.
He was also in the Treasury for a while. That's right. He went from Treasury over to Customs, then back into administration. Right. But there's a photograph which I saw about 6 months ago of a whole group of us. It included Japheth Delvaux, or J. Delvaux, Commodore Smith, B.K. Bonamy, and many of the then existing permanent secretaries. And we, even at that level, we were doing exposure. And this was being done through CARICAD in Barbados and through a UN grant. And there we were at the end of a 4-day workshop. So it was a constant, ongoing, evolutionary process of training. And I remember I'm standing next to Mr. Delvaux, who would have been a man probably over, at that time, near to his retirement. But he was still in training. He was always in training. And so even if you had brought these individuals in, Godfrey, you ought to have given them a program of training and evaluation and exposure. And that exposure would not only have been done locally, but could have been done abroad as well.
In 1967, when the Pinley government took the reins of government, they inherited a first-class permanent secretary corps from the UBP. They had people like Sir Foley News, Sir Brian Marvick,
Bamforth. Yeah.
right? Sir Foley News was a governor of a colony. That's why he was a sir. So Brian Marvick, they was a governor, but they were permanent secretaries. In agriculture, I had a man by the name of Mr. Charles Lynn.
Okay.
And he was very annoyed because he said he was in Nyasaland. People don't even know where Nyasaland is, right? He just missed getting his knighthood, right? But that was the quality of permanent secretary the PLP inherited.
Right.
But those men provided on-the-job training for people like Rodney Bain.
Rodney Bain, Betty Bethel, Hanford Darville.
Mr. Barnett.
Yeah, that's right, A.B. Barnett.
So you had that, then you had that first cadre, Horace Russell.
That's Horace
that
Russell.
first cadre of Bahamian permanent secretaries who were experienced and who were well trained on the job by the Englishman.
Yeah.
That's the man who invented the system.
That is correct. And in fairness to the Pinland government, even after they replaced some of them with Bahamians over a gradual process, many of them remained behind in technical. Codrington, for example, left the Ministry of Finance and he went to London as the High Commissioner, you see. So in other words, there is value in keeping experience around you. And I think that is what has been lost in the present situation. But to get back to the real point, the public service just can't be a place where you put square pegs in round holes. You've got to have an orientation and a background to it. And to get back to Mr. Enius' point, that first cadre of Bahamian permanent secretaries performed admirably. You had
Mr. Thompson,
Ellison Thompson, who was a nun. He had been a teacher, but he worked in the Treasury, and then he had he was a Family Island administrator for a while, and so on and so forth. Mr. H.C. Walkeen, Baltron Bethel. So Baltron Bethel had come up through the system and eventually became permanent secretary in Home Affairs, then Education, and then he went over to tourism as Director General of Tourism. So these people had a wealth of experience, and the experience had been passed on to them by the colonial administrators who insisted on certain points. And in fairness, again, the Pinland government, 1967 to 1973, which was the year of independence, decided that there was value in keeping these people around. They brought in people from other areas.
From Jamaica, they brought, what's his name? I forget his name.
Yes, there was.
He became Jamaican ambassador to the UN.
Okay, yes, exactly. Jeanette Bethel was married to Peter Bethel.
Yeah.
She was not a Bahamian, she was Trinidadian, but had married Peter Bethel from BEC, and she became permanent secretary at the ministry. Oh, you're talking about Mills? Mills. And she became permanent secretary, succeeding Mills, and so on in the Ministry of Development. But the point I think we need to get to is this. We know we have a problem. We know that the problem will become exacerbated as the public service becomes more expansive and becomes a bit more unmanageable.
But let me interject here.
Okay.
Emerson, there was regimentation.
Yes.
Regimentation. Every time I went to an island, I had to do a trip report.
Yes.
At the end of every month, I had to do a monthly report. At the end of every year, I had to do an annual report. Each section, each department, right? And when I was writing my book on the history of agriculture, that's what I used, those annual reports, right?
They were already there.
They were already there.
The information
right?
was there.
And you had annual reports go back as far as the 1919 and things like that.
Yes,
Before,
yes, yes.
there was a department.
Yes, yes.
There was regimentation. I'm willing to bet you, Mr. Jones, you go to the Ministry of Agriculture right now, and you ask them for an annual report.
Well,
You ask some of these ministries for annual or quarterly assessments. The regimentation and the structure is lacking.
You had systems in place.
you had systems in place, and because I think we were hoping to emulate the names that he called, we insisted that those remain in place. He's right about annual reports. I cannot recall the last time I saw an annual report from any of the technical departments being laid on the table of the House or being published as a public document. And this I think, is in many instances required by law. There's an audit report. We seem to run very fast looking at the audit, at the money side of it, but what about the programs for which the money is being spent? And that is not happening. Yeah. But to get back, if you don't mind, to the core point, sometimes you have to stop and review the journey and say, where have I gone wrong? I think we know what the issue is. You've touched on it. You've touched on what you call the, I guess, political politicization of the public service.
Yes.
The point here, and I said this to you privately, both of you, a few days ago, it's ironic that at a time when we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of qualified people in the country, we are not attracting some of them into the public service.
Beyond that, Mr. Smith, you have a public service that is bloated.
Mm-hmm. That is true.
The report stated that it is overstaffed by 40%. Mm-hmm. That is high. I don't know how it got 40%. Well, I believe I do know, but and it has again to do with politics.
Yes.
Finding jobs for supporters, your constituents, who came into the service not really being properly trained, and they were put on the payroll. Yes.
Well, that is true in one instance, but I take umbrage with the report in several ways. I haven't read it entirely, but I think we need to be cognizant of the peculiarities of the Bahamas. You have to accept that.
Yes.
So whereas in the Ministry of Education, you could have gotten by with maybe 25% staff less, you have almost a semi-structure in Abaco.
Yes.
You have in Grand Bahama.
Given the archipelagic nature.
That's right, yes, the peculiarities around the archipelagic nature of the country. So you've got clerks and assistant clerks and executive officers in these islands who have very little to do. But you have to have them, or you believe you have to have them. That's the problem. And so we will be bloated. So you can't just, in fairness to the system, you can't just say, but I'm going to get back to the bloatedness issue as a secondary issue.
But given the technological advances of the world...
Well, that's why I'm saying we do now need to look at reforms.
Yes.
Because with internet and with faxes and telephones and everything else, the visual age that we have, we do not really need for the commissioner in Colonel Hill, Crooked Island, to have 4 persons in that office, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you've got the health sector, which again is heavily oversubscribed because we need a nurse here, an assistant nurse there, a doctor here, a doctor there. And many of these people could be used elsewhere. But getting back to the situation here in New Providence and to the bloatedness of the thing, is that there are agencies where we have loaded up with people, but they are not at that management or what I would call the executive level. You see, and it gets back to the point of local government. Most countries could pare their public service radically, and they have done so, because many of the service being performed by the central government, such as garbage collection, such as street cleaning, whatever goes on. These are local government functions. And part of the public sector reform must be the introduction of an effective and standalone system of local government. And so you will be removing these persons from the central government role and putting them in local jurisdictions. Now, how you fund that will be the critical issue. So it doesn't mean that there will be an automatic reduction in the expenditure level, because I don't see very little revenue coming from local government entities. Certainly not the ones that we have now in the Family Islands, but certainly here in New Providence. I do not know why someone who has to sweep the street, clean the verges, do that, will say they are working for the central government. They should not be.
You see, when you have a situation, right, where people really don't know government in the Bahamas, I tell you why.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges the Christie administration had is that many people who worked for local governments in the Family Islands were made permanent and pensionable.
Precisely. Precisely.
They were made permanent and pensionable.
Well, that's my point.
Right? Because they said they've been working for local government for 20 years. They can't get no job letter. They can't get this. They feel disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. And they want to be made permanent and pensionable.
Yes.
So the government puts them on
the central right. Payroll, on the permanent and pensionable, and that is why it is bloated. So
that's what you see.
This is the
people
point.
Don't know.
But she makes that point, but she doesn't analyze that point. She should have done a more thorough analysis of that point. For example, the people who clean the schools, the janitresses, some of them have been working from 1973, yes. But because they work for an entity that is the government of the Bahamas and not the school district, which should have been autonomous and which should have had its own regulatory and other benefits, they have to be made permanent and pensionable.
But Luther,
yeah.
General Order says, you know, Brenda, if you were a casual worker for 5 or more years, you are eligible.
Yeah, eligible.
To become pensionable.
Yes.
That's General Orders.
Yeah. But
General Orders is understood by the vast majority of people in the public sector.
Some people who come to the sector don't understand General Orders.
Very few understand. Well, they should understand it. Very few really have an appreciation. Is it useful today? I think it's definitely outmoded.
Yes.
It was basically, see again, I started this whole conversation by saying that we have to remember where we came from. 64, 67, 73, and where we are now. General Orders was introduced to really deal...
Run an empire.
To run, well, it was basically, it's an agreement. It's an agreement which has been signed on to by the government and its employees. And I presume at that time, it must have had the approval of the public service unions.
But Luther,
yeah.
General Orders was to run an empire.
Yes, that's true.
An Englishman who
drafted
come here
yeah.
could go to Africa,
yes.
could go to the Caribbean,
yeah.
because he had General Orders.
Yeah, yeah.
It was organized to run an empire.
So General Orders is passé in the scheme of things.
Yeah, it's passé. The only usefulness about it is when it comes to some disciplinary matters. And when they want to use it for disciplinary matters, it's usually pull out General Orders says so and so and so. Okay. And General Orders says so and so. Or if you wish, for example, for someone who wants to use it for other reasons, well, under General Orders, I'm allowed 5 weeks leave or 7 days compassionate leave. Right. But most people do not really understand what it means.
Yes.
But
we want to take a break and you know, talking about compassionate leave. I'm always my mind is boggled when I see public servants who can get 30 weeks vacation. I just don't understand that.
Cumulative.
Yeah, but how
we'll talk
how
about
can you get 30 weeks of vacation? You have some people now who are on vacation and they've been on vacation for 30, 40 weeks.
Yeah, pre-retirement and something like that. Yeah.
Let's take this final break here and we'll come right back.
I'll tell you.